After leaving Pink Floyd at the beginning of 1968, Barrett had remained silent. After some abortive recording sessions with Peter Jenner in May, it wasn't clear if Syd Barrett was going to pursue a solo career at all.
Malcolm Jones, who was head of Harvest Records at the time, just got a call from Syd Barrett one day saying he wanted to come into, to do some more recording. But Syd came back in and played a few numbers for Malcolm Jones, and there were things like Opal and Swanley and whatever that and Malcolm Jones felt it was good, it was strong enough to do the album. And from then on, there was this fairly leisurely process where Malcolm Jones was producing, and Syd would do just very basic backing tracks with him and the black Telecaster he had at the time. And they didn't plug it in, they just mic'd it up and he used it as like an acoustic guitar. And when you look through the recording sheets, there's this sort of 6-month period where they're fiddling with the various songs and adding bits and pieces, and just things are slowly starting to take shape.
During this process, it was decided that several of the new recordings needed a band behind them. Barrett eventually approached a contemporary psychedelic group, Soft Machine, and invited them to guest on the new album.
We were playing in the 100 Club in Oxford Street in London. Anyway, after this gig, outside, Syd appeared. He'd been in the gig, and he knew Robert and Mike anyway from earlier days, although I'd never met him before. And he just kind of muttered, would you like to come and play on this record I'm doing? It was kind of very vaguely suggested. So we said okay. And so it was arranged for a couple of months later. Syd definitely didn't want session musicians, which we weren't anyway, so that was not a problem. So I guess he'd heard something when we played live, something about, I suppose, the power or the sounds, which, at that time, Soft Machine were quite weird at that time, and we were doing written pieces, but we were doing it quite heavily, with heavy sound, so I guess he felt that, he automatically heard something which he thought would fit the ambience of his music, and I think that's right. He wasn't trying to be control freak and have everything delineated as it should be, or as anyone else would. He was thinking more in terms of atmospheres, I think, and kind of feelings. So, the sound of Soft Machine probably fitted, at that time, fitted into his songs. When we got to Abbey Road Studios, Syd had got some demos, just voice and guitar, which we'd never heard before, and he had absolutely no suggestions for us what we should do. So we had to sit down in this very expensive studio and learn these tunes as we were going, and playing along with them, starting again. And we did our usual thing, lots of fuzz bass, fuzz organ, and Robert thundering away on drums. And we were kind of halfway to learning them, because they're not very easy songs. They're not difficult songs, but they're not symmetrical. So you might have 4 bars of this and half a beat there, and 3 bars maybe, and then it changes. So we had to learn this, and then after a couple of hours of each song, we'd had a go at this, and Syd came in and said, "Yeah, that's fine, yeah," and that's it. He was happy, although we felt we hadn't even learnt the songs. He felt that it was something which was okay for him, for the atmosphere of the tunes. So that was it.
I don't know whether they ran out of money or EMI was starting to question the length of time that the sessions were taking, but the generally agreed version of the story is that after this sort of leisurely 6-month period of sessions where Malcolm Jones was producing, Syd was given like 2 days to finish the album. 2 days of recording to finish the album. So there's one day, and I think it's David Gilmour and Syd doing Octopus, as we were talking about earlier, plus Golden Hair, which were tracks that Syd had tried recording in '68, but had ended up, the recordings from there were very, very loose. David Gilmour got different versions from Syd. He pushed Syd's come up with much tighter versions of both recordings. So that's one day, and the second day Roger Waters came in as well to help us producing, and it was literally Syd laid down half a dozen tracks, Dark Globe and If It's In You, and a few like this. That whole sequence on side 2 of Madcap Laughs, where they've joined 3 or 4 songs together, and you can hear Syd chatting in the studio, and he has the false starts and various bits and pieces. All that was done on one day. And then there's a day when David Gilmour comes in and mixes everything, even all the Malcolm Jones ones and all the stuff that he'd recorded. in the last 2 days. Then there's a day where Syd and David Gilmour decide what the track's going to be, and that's it, that's the album. So you've got like half the album's created in this leisurely 6-month sort of, you know, very laid-back atmosphere, and then you've got 2 days of frantic activity creating the other half.
With the album complete, EMI prepared to release what became Syd Barrett's final ever single, Octopus. However, in recent years, the lyrical content of the song has been re-examined.
When you first look at the lyrics to Octopus, you thought, where on earth, well, what's he writing about here? This is really wacky stuff. And what it transpires, what he's done, he's taken a whole load of lyrics from poems. There's one called The Old Man on the Border, which contributes a lot of the crack by scattered needles and The Old Man on the Border that crops up in the lyrics. And there's another one about the Grasshoppers Band, and that's where all that Grasshoppers Green Herbarian band business comes from.
And they're all sort of quoted from things like, things like Edward Lear and things like Green Grow the Rushes Hoe and that sort of thing. The Man on the Border, that's certainly from one of Edward Lear's limericks, I think.
Syd just seems very comfortable with that. I mean, he's created a great backdrop. I mean, it's a really strong song, Octopus. I mean, initially, when they first put the running order together for the Madcap Laughs, that was going to be the opening song, though they later switched the sides around. But it's a really strong song, hence the fact it came out as a single. And Syd, again, as the songwriter, he seems comfortable enough, well, I like that, I'll take a bit of that on, and he stitches them all together in a way that just works.
Madcap Laughs was released to substantial success in January 1970. However, elements of the album's production seem to be in direct contrast to what Syd had done previously with Pink Floyd.
Well, in many respects, the Madcap Laughs, I suppose, was the first underproduced album, whereas up to that point, people, for example, the Beatles, had been desperately trying to, with the help of people like George Martin, were trying to produce ever more polished and imaginative and orchestrated and cleverly arranged albums, using all the tricks of the studio as well. Session musicians brought in at the drop of a hat. So. But what you got with the Madcap, really, although there were attempts to use effects, mainly you're just getting raw Syd, and you're getting pauses and mistakes and fluffs.
It does have a very sparse sound. There aren't these sort of swirling psychedelic effects and that sort of thing. Why is that? I don't know. I mean, Syd seems to have called it a day with the sort of weird echo units and that sort of thing after Pink Floyd. I mean, maybe what he was trying to say was that really it's the songs that are important. I mean, that was what he'd been doing before Pink Floyd, He had his little folder of songs and he'd play his acoustic guitar to people at parties and that sort of thing. And I think there's some interview quote where he says, well, yes, it's just the same as it's always been, it's just me and an acoustic guitar getting the songs done.
And perhaps it was the only way that he could work by that stage, but it is very interesting that just as recording is going high-tech and, 4-track didn't come in until the kind of mid-60s, and then 8-track and 16-track and 32-track. And this is stripped down and raw, and years before anybody had invented the term lo-fi, or people were making records in their bedrooms or any of that, this record is pointing the way, really. So the way it sounds is just quite extraordinary and completely out of step with almost anything else at the time.
I really love you, and I mean you. The star above you, crystal blue.
You listen to the flow of the words, and what he seems to be doing is just laying back and letting it happen. He was capturing it rather like someone made fish, taking it out of the water and then throwing it down on pieces of paper and then seeing what he had at the end.
Another element of the album's production has been the cause of much debate over the years since its release. On the second side of the LP, several tracks contain false starts and imperfections that for many only add to the record's charm.
Yes, I'm thinking. Yes, I'm thinking. Look, you know, I'll start again. I'll start again.
David Gilmour's describing it in an interview. He said they wanted to give an idea of what was actually going on in the studio. I'm not sure quite what was going through their heads at the time. But when you look at the recording box, it's quite specific. The instructions are that it must be left like this. It's not a case of it was done accidentally or they didn't want to tidy it up or something. It was quite specific. They wanted to leave that section in as it was. And my reaction when I first heard the album wasn't, wow, listen to all that page turn. This is strange. It was just like almost like a jokey bit of fun. You know, here's an artist admitting admitting their foibles and that he makes mistakes and he has trouble singing sometimes. And it does work as a sequence. I mean, perhaps David Gilmour does regret it now. I don't know, but for me, it's an interesting bit of the album, and I think it works. And it works as a sequence. The way they have it on the album, it works, and I don't think there's any problem with it being included.
There's no doubt that the realism of the Madcap laughs is like no other realism of the time. You have to remember we were living in an era where artistic integrity overtook everything else. Everyone was living in an unreal world. Suddenly Syd Barrett came along, who was Mr. Unreal for so many people, and did the Madcap laughs, and what it has on the record are the false starts. It has that moments where things go wrong and it says, no, let's start again. It actually is a diary of the way the record was put together in the studio, which is quite remarkable because almost any other artist would have said, cut this out, cut that out, I don't want people to hear this. What Barrett said is, no, this is what the record is about. It's about the songs, but it's also about the moments when I get things wrong and what I learn through getting things wrong. And remarkably, it remained so underrated for several years after it came out. And suddenly the punk era came along, and what happened? The punk suddenly elevated Syd Barrett to a status that his erstwhile band, Pink Floyd, could never achieve with them because it was real. It was going straight to the heart. It was Syd Barrett, a voice and a guitar, saying, this is who I am, this is what I give you. And the punks took so much on board from that.
With Barrett doing hardly any promotion for the Madcap laughs, sessions for a second solo LP started almost immediately in February 1970. However, these sessions were to be very different to those of the previous album.
Well, Madcap Laughs was a marginal success. At least it got Syd Barrett back working and showing that he really did want to create a solo career after leaving Pink Floyd. But I think people felt that he really needed a push to produce some work that was more organised for the second album. And this is where his old friend Dave Gilmour came into play.
Involved right from the start, and I think he went for a much more structured approach than perhaps Malcolm Jones had gone. Malcolm Jones, I think, had let Syd drive the process. I think David Gilmour took a much more active producer's role. But again, I mean, they started off with just Syd and his guitar, and you talk to the engineers, and it was basically recording just tracks with Syd and an acoustic guitar, and then they overdub all the instruments on top of that. I think the difference this time around was that David Gilmour would push Syd more to try and get a best performance from him. I mean, you could say in a way he did, there are chunks of David Gilmour on that album rather than Syd Barrett, simply because, as he said, Syd had finished a number and that was it. He'd stop singing and that was it. He'd stop playing. So he'd have to add, to finish the song off, he'd have to add a long fade out. And there's, at least one point on the album where, it's David Gilmour, Rick White and Jerry Shirley jamming in the studio just to finish give a reasonable fade out to something that Syd had created the basic structure for.
Even though the more rigid format of the Barrett sessions ensured that the record was released a mere 9 months after the Madcap laughs in November 1970, it also stripped the record of some of the innovative features that had made Syd's first solo effort so unique.